start. Yes, welcome to this Team Society webinar, this time on pilot projects and demonstration projects in the energy transition. This is a presentation based on a recently published book, which you already see here on the slide. Today's speakers are Marianne Ryghaug and Tomas Skjølsvold, who both are professors at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture. And we also have a discussant today, Marianne, who is a researcher at Syntef Energy and responsible for the coordination of pilot projects at the FME Sineldi. So we are very happy to have all of you here. Just very briefly, this webinar is part of a webinar series, which is organized by NTNU Team Society, which is one of several teams under the strategic research area NTNU Energy. And we focus on social science and humanities research on issues related to energy and sustainability. So then I would like to give the word to Tomas and Marianne.
Yes, I will start then. Yes, first by saying you can see the cover of the book here, and as we already mentioned, it's oh, you went a bit fast forward. It's open access, so it's for free, so you can reach it by clicking on the link. Yes, then the next. So a little bit about the book in a nutshell. In this book, we look at the role of pilot and demo projects as crucial devices and key sites for conducting innovation in the context of energy transition. And we noticed the way pilot projects have become omnipresent in contemporary society, and the way they significantly contribute to not only the innovation journeys, but also the shaping of future society. And our argument is therefore that they deserve a broad social scientific analysis. And in this book, we analyze these kind of projects along two main axes. We look at the way they are produced, what kind of resources, interests, narratives, etc., that make them happen, and we also look at what they do. So, do they obscure the politics of change? Do they open up for new politics and new ways of participation? And how do they transform societies? And from this, we also draw some conclusions about their implications for the research and innovation policy in the last chapter. Next. So the focus of this first chapter, some background noise. The focus on the first chapter. Here we discuss the way societies are transformed through pilot and demo projects, and we argue that pilots are key sites of energy and climate transitions. Mostly based on science and technology studies, but also referring to the sustainability transitions literature, the chapter argues that pilots are important sites, important political sites for the production of future socio-technical order, where different solutions and socio-technical systems are kind of beta tested before fully introduced in society. And in the book, we use a relatively broad definition of pilots, experiments, and demos. We use these three words almost as synonyms in the book. So the broad definition is that they include relatively small projects as well as larger targeted sets of projects and policies that set out to explicitly create and test new socio-technical realities within a demarcated site. And in the book, this type of pilots that we analyze can be said to be a form of hybrid, in that they often intend to demonstrate to funders, governments, publics, etc., that some socio-technical configuration can work in real life, while at the same time they they show us that we can learn how they interact with some elements in the real world. For instance, user aspects or acceptance. And we also see that the goals of such projects often differ. Sometimes they're about verifying technology, sometimes they are more about challenging regulations, investigating acceptance, for instance, and social learning. So in some way, this might be seen as a typical critique from social science and humanities of the tendency to look at this kind of pilot and demo projects as too narrowly focused and too technology focused. Next. So in the book, we focus on the way pilot projects become part of broader societal transition processes. They both formulate and materialize future societies in specific directions beyond the specific site, and through this they shape future societies, both with regards to direction and speed. This has contributed to an interest in pilot and demo projects as political sites, as I just mentioned, and this also serves to bring out a critique where such projects are seen as privatization of decision-making capabilities, or translations of societal issues into economic issues, or also a suspension of democratic processes. And inspired by Noche Mares and others, we look into how they potentially give room to new modes of public participation in energy transition activities, and how they may be seen in relation to new forms of democratic decision-making. So in doing so, we go beyond seeing pilots as only efforts to upscale certain technological solutions, but we are more interested in their wider socio-political consequences. Yes, next.
Right, and then we are a duo. So I'll talk a bit from here. So what Marianne, I guess, summarizes kind of chapter 1, which synthesizes a bit, and then here in chapter 2, we sort of move into more concretely studying these projects, and we take different types of inspirations. So from the sociology of science, we sort of observe that there is a tendency for technological projects and outputs to be shaped by the societal conditions. But then we're also interested in sort of the role of the objects in themselves, the materiality here, and kind of how technologies are also part of shaping future societies, as Marianne noted here. And in some, this is leading us to an interest in a sort of co-production of science, technology, and society. So it's not here that these technologies determine how we end up as a society, or it's not that we as a society determine the state of technologies, but together these elements produce society. And I have a bit of lag in clicking, so I'm trying to change the slide now, but it's not doing anything. But there we are. We focus on 3 types of projects in this book, and I will just give a couple of examples. One of them, these are sort of technology-oriented projects. We have examples of projects that are geographically bound, typically sort of islands or cities. And then we also have a sort of a third category, called the national laboratory, which is, much broader than a small pilot project, but it can still be analyzed as such, we argue in this book. Just to give you a couple of examples, this one will be familiar to some of you. of the kinds of projects that we look at and how we look at them. This is purely technical, quote unquote, smart grid laboratory. It's located at Skjølsvold at our own university, and it's a miniature power grid. It is in many ways a sort of classical laboratory, and I'll say a bit about why we've included it in a bit. It's a kind of particular site where industry researchers work together to sort of verify technology, and they do so under, I guess, systemic but not very realistic conditions. And this laboratory, it is interesting in several ways. I mean, it's a kind of a child of the period that it emerged from, early 2010s. There was a large focus on digitalization in general. Smart grids was kind of popping up as a theme. Smart meters were increasingly being debated. And the Research Council and the industry, they funded this laboratory as a sort of response to uncertainty that emerged with this new technology. So they were wondering, what would a future smart grid look like? And they set up this lab as a way to test those new technologies. Researchers, they sort of at that time used this lab to interact with industry and to kind of sell their research as a way of dealing with this industry-oriented uncertainty. So the university and also Sintef, highly involved in this, used this to sort of also used it to make their own organizations more attractive for international collaboration. And a kind of another point here that emerged throughout the kind of brief history of this lab is that it has become a kind of site of public and political engagement. So it's, and I've kind of been part of this myself at a couple of occasions, that when NTNU or Sintef wants to display how they are doing in the energy transition, they take notable people to this place and kind of show off how a vision or an idea of what a future energy system will look like is practically being made. So we discussed this laboratory in slightly critical ways. We'll return to why that is not necessarily a critique of the people involved there in a while. But from 2005 to 2010, the smart grid and those technologies were understood as a set of technological solutions basically to technical challenges in the grid, and this then is reflected in the research and the innovation activities, innovation policy also of that time, and reflected in the way that NTNU and Sintef at that time sort of conducted research, and that is not strange, and it's reflected in the piloting activities of that time. So the reason, I guess, why we take such an interest in that particular place is that it has been central in giving direction to and sort of framing to a lot of the research and innovation activities in this field over the last sort of 10, 15 years, and that it has been absolutely central, I guess, for technology development, but also on a slightly critical note then to kind of strengthen the technological, purely technological framing of what the smart grid is or could be. So the other kind of example that we take the time to use in this presentation is of a different type, but it has some of the similar issues. This is a pilot that has been forged kind of in what we can call the health energy nexus. It's located in Stavanger, which has some characteristics. It's a wealthy region, oil intensive industry, high population growth, and has a very strained sort of electricity grid. And the electricity company involved in this, they conducted a series of workshops several years ago where they were keen on introducing the idea of smart grids, but they kind of framed it slightly differently. So they invited a lot of societal actors and try to figure out how smart could improve sort of local society. And they forged here a alliance between healthcare actors and energy actors, ICT actors, and sought out ways to use smart energy technology to sort of combine energy management with healthcare. And end result was a test of a series of kind of home control technologies, which on the one hand was meant to enable people living longer at home, but on the other hand had energy management and demand management as sort of byproduct of that. And the framing is broader than the laboratory. It's about energy management, it's about healthcare, but it's still a kind of technologically oriented fix to these challenges. Users have been involved, but it's very much on the terms of how do you implement these technological systems as best as possible. And I think sort of building on the things that Marianne said about the politics here of these projects, a key potential issue is that this type of merger not only feeds into shaping future energy demand, but also shaping kind of the way that welfare state is operated, basically. So what we do when we do these origin studies is that we observe kind of that these pilots are locally embedded, so they seem local, but they also mobilize resources that circulates through global networks, EU and those types of places. And what happens typically is that the projects, they tend to reflect and legitimate and sometimes even sort of amplify the interests of those who are involved here. So we think there's a wide potential to experiment, with social aspects here as well, but they are primarily made to materialize distinct technological visions. And paradoxically, this means that they sometimes also end up conserving interests and ways of doing things and power relations rather than, while they're framed as highly innovative projects. And then I'll hand the word back to Marianne.
Yes, thank you. So in this third chapter, we start out from the assumption that given that such projects are central in shaping future societies, we should have a broad interest in their shaping and who is included in their shaping, if they are inclusive, and looking at that kind of processes. And we build this on the literature on democratization of science and just transitions, and consider participation broadly as two concepts, and which both looks at this as participation, as orchestration, and as a distributed phenomenon. So we highlight the way actors participate in such innovation activities and the work that goes into those kind of processes, and the role of technologies in shaping the material participation of energy citizenship, which I will come back to. If you can change the slide. Yes. So we have coined, or it's not our own, it's not our concept, but we focus on the participation, and we see participation not as something that can be seen as external to technoscientific endeavors, but something that is a part of scientific practice. So we use this metaphor of orchestration to make this point explicit. And inspired by a lot of recent scholarship within STS, which highlights that participation is something that is co-constructed, relational, emergent, and that is in the making. We see participation not as this kind of typical individual thing that you can either opt in or opt out of, but as something that is involving in many different ways and places. And we use the concept of orchestration to highlight this, that the participation is something that is orchestrated through the distributed collectives of orchestration. That is how different collectives or groups, you might say, of policy making and research development and innovation and design is shaping the work of actors in these different sites. So we look at public participation. If you look at how this is done in many of the projects that we have studied, we see that public participation typically have been orchestrated with this specific technocentric goals in mind, as mentioned in the previous examples. Typical questions are then, how do we get the public to consume in new ways? How do we overcome social barriers? And how do we change behavior? So, and this means that even though while fundamentally seeking to change society, that these types of questions posed to the public through these kind of projects are in a way conservative rather than transformative. So they focus on this quite conservative parts of the circle, the quite common traditional ways of thinking about how to engage publics, and not these other possibilities with the rings around them in this slide. And this means that they are all often closing down and deal with very limited aspects of participation rather than opening up and looking at the more creative potentials of participation. Yes, and so in this chapter we also link this to a concept called material participation, and we link this concept to the concept of energy citizenship that provide a more object-centered approach to thinking about how to engage people and the relationship between technology, politics, and participation. And we look at how technologies become part of everyday practices in creative ways, and argue that this way of looking at technologies and how they engage people can help produce energy citizenship, as this kind of ways of enabling engagement make new forms of awarenesses and new forms of literacy and knowledge. And we also see new types of practices. And the typical examples that we use in the book for showing this, how material participation is forming energy citizenship, is EVs, smart meters, solar panels, mostly these domestic types of technologies. But as most of the discussion have tended to focus on the potential of this kind of mundane technologies that I just mentioned, and the objects that internalize enable action within the households. We also extend this in the book and look at concepts that also look at examples of how pilot projects and demo projects may shape more collective processes of energy citizenship formation. And we use these examples of smart charging of EVs as an example that we use as it's shaping typically large. It's something that we find in typically large garages and large shared households. And we use that to bring out and highlight how these types of transitions going on, at least many places in Norway right now, are actualizing the equity and justice perspectives of energy transitions. So in this way, they are producing collective knowledge among a new group of actors. For instance, we see this in the boards of collective housing and among tenants and other intermediary actors. And we see them as producing new electricity grid management practices on behalf of these collective housing boards. So altogether, we see this as examples that indicate that there are broad potentials of active participation that very seldom are exploited in this other types of pilots or the framing of the pilots. And we therefore call for more experimentation and active nurturing of this new and other forms of more collective participation.
Okay, so then we're almost done. What have we learned? The final chapter here sort of sums up our lessons. Well, we've learned that pilot projects are often framed in radically sort of transformative ways, but they are surprisingly conservative. They focus on technology, they focus on behavior change, consumption, these types of things. So sometimes a very narrow understanding of what technology can do, and on the other hand, very narrow understanding of what the social implications of technological change might be. So this, we think, is a paradox that, rhetorically, technologies tend to be part of elaborate societal visions of change. Public activity is often flagged as central, but in practice, not often the case. And there we are. So there's an asymmetry here that we're interested in addressing. Again, strong and clear technology goals, but weak social goals. So we sort of want to challenge the innovators here. How can you also develop strong societal goals alongside the strong technical goals? We suggest here that looking at literature, for instance, on energy justice and just transitions can be a way of finding these social goals. Social goals tend to be rhetorically powerful, but poorly reflected in practice, and also in the sort of involved competence of these projects that we've looked at. So are the innovators to blame then? Not only. They are part of kind of an institutional reality that both expects, rewards, and produces these types of projects. Funding tends to be geared towards finding the techno-economic solutions. So then it's not so strange that innovators and researchers pursue them. And in these kind of ways of thinking, then human agency, the ways that we humans act, it's kind of a residual category. It's not a key interest, and it's primarily thought of either as consumption or as being irrational, a non-technical barrier to proper change. And I won't go deeply into this, but social sciences and humanities have suggested a lot of ways out, producing new frames of innovation that urges us to kind of start with different questions when addressing challenges like climate change and energy transitions. And we think that this requires a kind of reformulation of innovation policy, that we find new metrics to measure success and these types of things. So we have a series of things that we want to kind of take away as take-home points. And if you've read this book, then you'll kind of go home with an impression that the responsibilities of achieving these changes, they are distributed. So it's not only the innovators, but other actors across levels deal with this. And that leads us to call for pretty ambitious goals in terms of, inclusively working to engage the societal actors of different types in transition work. And inclusivity here means, looking beyond those dominant forms of knowledge that today dominate this field of pilot and demonstration activities, but to look at different disciplines, different actors, other types of citizens, and to ask different questions from them. And we think, that innovation policy should more or less force the formulation of different and distinctly different social goals alongside the very strong technological ambitions that are already there. Participation and engagement, we think these are key aspects of many pilot and demonstration projects in wording, but that they should also be given sort of practical priority. And we'd argue that innovators and designers should embrace and experiment with these things, how, for instance, to exploit these political qualities of technologies in new ways. Innovation policy should probably embrace, to a larger extent, the social and normative goals about, which future society do we want. And finally, then this point about transition literature, which has tended to emphasize, shared visions and the building of consensus. We argue that there is a need to kind of go beyond that and recognize that there's likely to be a lot of conflict around here, and kind of experimenting in ways that engages those types of conflicts head on is probably needed over the coming years.
Tomas, you have been muted the last seconds.
Okay, for a long time?
Maybe 15 seconds or something like that.
Okay, I won't repeat the last 15 seconds, but then I'll stop sharing, and there's that.
Okay, then I would like to thank Marianne and Tomas for a great presentation, probably also challenging some of the things happening at NTNU. So I really hope for a nice discussion in the next half an hour. But first, I would like to give the word to Maren Ista, who is our discussant today.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. If not, you should give me a sign. Yeah, you're nodding. Okay, then I'm on. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Marianne, and I work at Sintef Energy Research, and I'm part of a FME called Synaldi, which has a large technological fix, to say it the least. So I think you're reading this book and seeing what you're pointing at. I think you're spot on at a lot of stuff, and it's easy to make technological goals. Does this thing work or not? That's easy, and it's kind of objective. And then you get into the more social goals. That's more scary for us with the technocentric tendency. But I do think they're implicit in a lot of the things that we do. And we do want to affect society, even though we won't admit it. We want people to start using electricity at 8 in the morning and do it at 12 and so on. So we do want to affect society. Yes, we do. And I think it's also for electricity transporters, the DSOs, those are monopolies. So they are like obliged by law to do social economical analysis and do good to reduce outages, to reduce the grid tariffs. So I think it's a bit of a maybe for us it's a passive involvement, that we have like performance indicator that kind of we do it for society, but it's not active participation. I agree on that one. So I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on the ways out of this. Is it interdisciplinary work? Is it what is the first step? Is it the design of the pilots? Do we get out of the starting block on the wrong foot, or where to start?
Yeah, do you want, Marianne, or should I?
Same for me.
Well, I can. So I don't know what is exactly the first step, but so it's likely a combination of things. So on the one hand, it's really nice that you kind of acknowledge the social dimensions of the engineering activities and the the social goals basically of the stuff that is done, and I definitely recognize that from Sinelli myself also. But I think you're onto something in terms of the interdisciplinarity, which is interesting and a good way to proceed, but which is also pretty tricky because as you say, the technological goals, they are often quite clear, whereas the social goals are often more diffuse, and they demand asking different types of questions. And I think social scientists might probably come across as a bit challenging in these constellations where maybe some actors just want to get something done, whereas the social scientists, they we are loose, I don't want to say obscure, but we can somehow so there is this so how do you reach something that how do you even begin addressing the same reality? But I think you need to actually start there. So and a big challenge for the social scientists is that either we are on the one hand not involved in that design projects process, or on the other hand we come on board too late to be able to do anything than evaluate if it worked or not. And yeah, so there is a partial answer there.
Yeah, I can just add, I also think it's about how you frame it from the beginning, and I think you're really spot on when you say that there are social goals implicit in many of these more technological oriented pilots, and that's perhaps the key thing, to actually bring them out and make them more explicit from the beginning. Then it's also more obvious that social scientists actually have a role in the conducting and setting up this kind of pilots.
Yeah, I think that's a good view, because we also always look at outages and stuff that involves real people, but it's so implicit in the way we think that I think that's something to think about more, because it's there. It's not just does it work, but does it fulfill the goal, the kind of society goals that we do have when working with monopolies like grid companies that are regulated. And in Sinelli, we use this system innovation because we do have discovered that testing technology is not the only thing. We need to also change maybe regulation, organization. It's not like network companies, it's kind of embracing everything new. And also society at large. Will you change your demand? Will you get up 9 in the morning to save the network? So we talk about this system innovation. Is that a term that you use, or at least the same content, if not the same word?
Yes, I think we don't use that word for ourselves, but I think the thinking is a bit the same as from what I have understood about system thinking, at least.
Yeah, I think we more or less use it, and not the word, but I think we have a similar understanding of what it means.
That's
There's
good.
also a question in the chat, I see.
Yeah.
Should we take that now, or is it for after? Do you have more questions or
I have
comments?
one more, and then I will leave. I have 48,
Great.
so I will invite you for coffee whenever the pandemic ends. I was just wondering about the 8 lessons. Are there any that you would emphasize for someone with a technology fix like me? Is there anything you would emphasize of these lessons?
Yeah, so I mean, I can try to tie it to your last question about system innovation, because I have I've heard this this talk of system innovation in Synality for a long time, and I sympathize with it. The challenge is that the way I would see it is that the system innovation is rigged to affect a whole system, but the kind of questions that are asked to the system are primarily technological. And I hear that you say that there is then this interest in organizations and things like that. But in practice, there's really no way, I think, to measure, for instance, in Synality, how what are the organizational consequences of that work, because the demos or the pilots hasn't been set up in a way that can actually be measured. So I think then it's related to the 8 lessons, and it would be about asking these questions early on. So if you have a gadget that will impact the system, then I would think about kind of how to measure and to think about what that means for the different actors across the system, and to have that early on as an integral part of the work and not as kind of afterthoughts, which is what it often is.
Yes, and if I could add one point, I also think there is a difference in how open you are to negative consequences and things not really the things that you're not really trying to achieve in the project.
Mhm.
At least why my familiarity with these kind of concepts are that they are very positivistic in a way, like trying to make something happen effectively and trying to impact the system, but maybe not so interested in negative effects and consequences that go beyond the system. And I think probably we as social scientists are more interested in those aspects that easily fall outside such a system, or where you draw the boundaries of the system.
Not just the energy system, but larger.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for the comments.
Yes,
Exactly,
thank you,
thanks.
Maren. Then there's a question from Stig. Do you want to ask it directly?
Sure. So thanks a lot for a very interesting speech. I am really looking forward to diving into this book, and I have sort of ended up in both ends of the table here now, being a researcher, applying for projects for many years, and now sitting in one of the boards in the research council and looking at the process from the other side. So my primary occupation then is that if you see that there's a need to change sort of the research and innovation instruments to address these challenges, because there's a lot of discussions internally in the research council that I know best, where we try to support these kind of more radical change approaches, but there are a lot of sort of institutionalized resistance. Among the most central one is that most of the monies that enter the research council comes from departments, ministries that work within silos, and they have specific goals and ways of framing issues that are not necessarily encouraging these kind of interdisciplinary and more radical approaches. So I was wondering if you had any reflections on that issue.
I'm sure we do. You want to go first, Marianne?
Yeah, that's key points, I think, in the last chapter of this book, where we dive into this kind of questions. Because you're right, of course, that how the funding agencies are framing research and innovation is reproducing this kind of ways of doing innovation, and how people can participate to a large extent. And those are the kind of mechanisms that also are shaping this kind of focus on users and merely as consumers, for instance, in a lot of research programs, not only in Norway, but perhaps even more so in the EU. So there's a need to focus more on more bold projects, perhaps, and what we call transformative innovation policy type of frameworks that take contested areas and who have a broader view on who should be part of this kind of projects as a kind of premise for doing research, as most of the research is still within the kind of second frame. A lot of the problem is also that it's about economic growth mainly, and it's not taking the SDGs as a starting point. So you can also question the direction of innovation that they are pushing in favor of within already these programs and how they are set up. Yeah, so many things to say about this.
Yeah, I can add a point to the things you've already said, which is that then the transition question here is not only then about kind of how to transition the energy systems, but I think the word resistance from incumbents that you mentioned, Stig, also within places like the Forskningsråd and these kinds of places is key. That there is, there are people with certain types of competence and vested interests and ideas that occupy key places, and they then, of course, in a sense, formulate ideas, from where they are, and they couldn't do anything else, I guess. But so then there is a need, in my view, to actually actively work to change these things. And transformative innovation policy is interesting, but there's also the real danger that it just becomes a redressing of whatever is there already, if it's not kind of followed up with actual new ideas and new competence and new ways of doing things and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then we have a hand in the NTNU Energy office and a question from Ruth afterwards.
Yeah, it's Johan Hustad. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and I will also look into the book. I think very much on the piloting is taken from industry in a way. It's an industrial way of thinking, because that's what industry does when they want to develop new technologies that is more competitive, etc. You need to scale up. To say it a little bit simple, to get the cost down, etc., etc. If you look at, and that doesn't in the beginning, it does not involve people or a society or whatsoever. It's just an industrial product, and if it's competitive, it will be sold. But in many cases, people don't want the product, and then they are in a way involved too late. But if you look at another example, I think like the zero emission building, the pilot house, that's something that is closer to where you involve social sciences and humanities, because you build one pilot house, you test new technologies, you move people in, and you see how people react on the technologies before it's really scaled up in society. Hopefully it will be, or you make changes that involves that you take care of the social and humanities research and innovations and change, for instance, the technology or change the service that is elaborated. I completely agree that let's say we very often use the term technology readiness level, right? And but there are at least two other dimensions, that is as you have been pointed out, society as well as the consumer itself. If you have the technology and the consumer don't want it, all right, then you have done something wrong. You have not involved the consumer early enough in the process or in the piloting or whatsoever. But it's the same with society. You need to have the regulations, as what was mentioned here also. So all these three dimensions at least depends on each other. When you choose smart grid, I see that that's interesting because it is a new system, and it reflects directly to the consumer in a way, so that the consumer can make choices. Let's say if you in a house have batteries, you have solar cells, etc., etc. You can actually choose what to do. In a monopolistic system, as we have had earlier, you couldn't make those choices. But if you take another example, like the ferries, when we have battery on ferries, zero emission ferries, you develop new technologies to put them into the ferries, but who cares? The people just travel from one place to another. They don't care about the technology or the pilot or what it is. So there are also different ways of how to choose a type of let's say pilots. So my question is the motivation for looking at smart grids specifically.
Yeah, I can comment, and we used two examples from smart grids now, but the book also has other examples, and I will you know, it's dangerous because, you know, you're in many ways you can think of Johan as our boss at Plenty of New Energy, but I fundamentally disagree with much of what you just said, because yes, it might be that a battery in a boat doesn't matter for people, but if you look at the recent transition that we had in Trondheim from one bus system to another bus system, it's quite clear that people have massive opinions about how a transportation system looks and what that means in practice. And I guess if you begin, you know, taking seriously that what we've experienced with electric vehicles, for instance, that, you know, if a battery is not only a fuel, it's also something that affects how we travel and how we transport ourselves. And I think it's fairly safe to assume that there, you know, a shift to a fully electrified fleet of ferries will probably entail changes that aren't, you know, just about replacing one fuel to another. Maybe you need to plan the distances differently. Maybe you need to schedule differently. Maybe you need to rebuild the harbor. Maybe so. There's all kinds of. If you really take the systems perspective seriously, then I think it's a fundamental error to assume upfront that the thing that we're trying out here will not affect society, because in some way it always does, and it is a big problem that we too often assume that it doesn't. And you know, 10 years ago people were saying that windmills, who cares? We know now that a lot of people care. So, and that was just some reflections around that struck me while you were talking.
Now, am I allowed to say something? A small comment. Of course, I agree.
Very short.
It reflects the society, of course. if you have the whole system approach to this. That was more, in a way, concerning the consumer as such. But of course, as you also pointed out earlier, the many people does not do the big changes, as you also pointed out in the newspaper. In the pandemic, people do react in a way very systematic and very strong, but in the climate, it's a little bit more reluctant, you could say. But that was one example. But I think there are, as I pointed out, I tried to say that there are three dimensions. It is at least then technology, society, and consumer, and these have to play together. I agree on that, of course. So this ferry was just an example of the consumer taking a trip, you could say. But of course, if you put the whole society around it and you build the whole electricity system, it will affect many other things as well. So that's. But I think this is a very good example of this piloting is the zero emission building, because there you have been involved early on, and what is interesting there is actually to see what are the implications of doing interdisciplinary research in such a context. That's very, because that was also discussed by or asked by Stig, the interdisciplinary context here, and that is the closest I can find here at
short
NTNU.
comments. Short comments.
Sorry.
Okay, shall we continue with Ruth? Your question.
I was just commenting on, wanted to ask really if you looked into industry partners' role in piloting, because they have an important role in a lot of the pilots that we're working with. They are funding, they have very clear intentions often, and they're not always so engaged with the societal issues. Some of them are, because we have also municipalities as well. That's another part of it. But and they have specific desires when they're involved. So I wondered if you'd looked into that in the book.
Yeah.
Want to comment, Marianne?
Yeah, I can comment on that. Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that's also what we have been trying to highlight when we have been discussing these types of projects, to bring out how interest of different, we would call this also representatives of different kinds of publics. So these industry interests, they form and shape, and a lot of these pilots are shaped around these types of interests. So that's one of the reasons why we think it's we kind of miss the point when you only focus on the consumers, because these are also ways or parts of the public, both shaping and being impacted, of course, by this kind of innovation activities. So the book exactly tries to do that, to broaden this kind of scope of who is actually shaping innovation and who is made to participate and can become part of that as part of how these types of innovation activities are set up. So yeah.
Thank you. So considering the time, I don't know if you have time to stay another 2-3 minutes, Tomas and Marianne, to give brief answers to the comment from Ida about the mission-based formulation of research and innovation projects.
Yeah, it's also one of those interesting. I mean, Marianne mentioned earlier the transformative innovation policy, and so mission-based innovation is, very related kind of way of thinking, and I think it's pretty interesting. So we have recently submitted a research proposal trying to understand what that might be. So it really depends on what is put into the mission, you know, and how it's formulated, which questions they ask. If it's, as it sometimes is, just about sort of catering for a direction of investments and activities, then I don't see the big transformative potential. But if it's actually about asking questions about justice, equity, which societies we want, and these kinds of things, then it might be. So it really depends on the content, I would say.
Thank you. And then a very last brief question from Giuseppe.
Yes, thank you. I'm quite interested in your presentation, and I was starting to look at the book online, and I was wondering if in the pilots that you looked at, you found what I think is a problem in many pilots happening nowadays and regarding the energy transition, the fact that often the users that are targeted are middle-class educated citizens that have skills and abilities to engage with technology innovations that instead are out of reach for people that have less skills and less societal, let's say, inclusion because of education or income. I think this is there is a potential, in my opinion, of a growing gap between those that have a more privileged position in society and those that instead have a disadvantaged position due to the energy transition itself. And I wonder if you see this risk yourself, having researched this field so far.
Yeah, I will agree. We see that this very clearly. There is this hierarchy of different kinds of publics, you can say, that are invited into these kind of projects. And firstly, you have all the industry interests, and when it comes to ordinary users, there are obviously broad parts of users that are never invited or do not have the facilities to participate. For instance, I think we use one of the examples we use in the book is about PV, and a lot of those projects that experiment with PV or some kind of smart house setup, the condition that you live in a house, that you own your own house, you have actually or you have access to an electric car, and so there is obviously issues when it regards equity and justice that are very much tied into this, and also the concept that we use of material participation is also something that could be used to strengthen this kind of perspective, or to make it more obvious who is actually made part of innovation and activities that can engage people in this kind of questions as the energy transition. As some people have access to certain technologies and things that makes it possible to engage more actively, while others clearly don't. So that's another aspect of it. Do you want to add something, Tomas?
No, we're a bit over time already, so I'll that's a good answer.
Okay, then I would like to thank everyone